The candles in Ashford Manor burned low that evening, and Cordelia Voss, Duchess of Wrentham, keeper of 3 estates, and mother to the most eligible bachelor in all of Virginia, stood in the kitchen with flour on her hands and fire in her chest. Not as herself, of course. Tonight she was Della, a borrowed maid's apron tied around her waist, her silver hair pinned beneath a cotton cap. She had not come to serve champagne. She had come because 3 weeks ago her son Evander Voss had arrived home with a woman on his arm and stars in his eyes, and something about it had made Cordelia's blood run cold. No one could explain it, not even her. But a mother always knows. From across the ballroom, she watched the woman, Miss Seraphine Alcott, soon to be announced as Evander's intended, laugh at something a senator whispered in her ear. It was a beautiful laugh, practiced, like a song learned by repetition, never by feeling. Cordelia reached for a tray of crystal glasses, and that's when she heard it. 2 voices, low, urgent, slipping through the cracked door of the east parlor like smoke under a door. "She doesn't know yet," one said. "She won't," said the other, and Cordelia recognized that voice immediately. It was Seraphine. "By the time the Duchess figures out who I really am, it will already be too late." Cordelia's hand stilled on the tray. The glasses trembled, and somewhere deep in her chest, every instinct she had ever silenced, as a proper woman, roared back to life. Who was this woman? What was she hiding, and how much had Evander already lost? What does Seraphine know that Cordelia doesn't? What secret is worth hiding inside a duchess's own home, on the night of an engagement celebration? And if Cordelia exposes her, will it save her son, or destroy him? If you need to find out what Seraphine is hiding, and trust me, you are not ready for the truth, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because part 2 drops soon, and I promise you, this story is only just beginning. Cordelia did not move. She stood in that narrow corridor between the kitchen and the east parlor, with a tray of untouched champagne in her hands, and the whole world tilting beneath her feet. The voices had gone quiet now, swallowed back behind the parlor door as quickly as they had escaped it, but the words remained, hanging in the warm air like smoke from a snuffed candle. "By the time the Duchess figures out who I really am, it will already be too late." She replayed it, once, twice, searching for a way it could mean something innocent, searching the way a woman searches a dark room for the shape of a monster, praying she will find only furniture. She found no furniture. Around her, the manor hummed with the sound of celebration, shoes against polished floors, the delicate scrape of violin strings tuned just slightly too high, the laughter of men who had drunk enough to be generous, and women who had drunk enough to be honest. Ashford Manor looked exactly as it always did on a night of occasion, luminous, commanding, draped in candlelight that made even ordinary things look precious. But Cordelia had built this house from grief and grit and 20 years of silent decisions, and she knew every sound it made. Tonight it sounded wrong. She set the tray down on a side table and straightened the cap over her silver hair. No one looked at her. That was the peculiar mercy of invisibility, the one advantage to this disguise she had not fully anticipated when she had borrowed the apron from a wide-eyed kitchen girl named Bet and pressed 2 gold coins into her palm in exchange for her silence. Servants moved through rooms like water through a sieve. No one watched the water. No one counted the drops. Cordelia had counted on exactly that. She had arrived at her own home 3 days ago, not as the Duchess of Wrentham, but as a woman hollowed by suspicion, and too proud to admit she did not know what she was looking for. She had told herself it was maternal instinct. She had told herself any reasonable mother would have done the same. But if she were being honest, and Cordelia Voss was, at her core, a ruthlessly honest woman, she had come because of the portrait. It was a small thing, hardly worth mentioning. A miniature portrait she had found tucked inside Evander's traveling coat when she'd visited him in Baltimore 2 months prior. She had not gone looking for it. She had simply reached into his coat for a handkerchief, the way she had done since he was 7 years old, and perpetually unprepared for the cold, and her fingers had closed around a small oval frame instead. The woman in the portrait was beautiful, dark-haired, pale-eyed, with a mouth painted into a smile that somehow never quite reached those eyes. There was a name inscribed on the back in handwriting she did not recognize. Not Seraphine, another name entirely. She had asked Evander about it that same evening, her voice careful, her face composed, the face she had perfected over 2 decades of widowhood and boardrooms, and men who mistook her patience for weakness. He had laughed it off, said it was an old gift from a friend, said she worried too much. He had kissed her cheek and changed the subject with the ease of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that his mother would not press if he deflected gently enough. He had learned that from her, and she resented it now in a way she could not explain. 2 weeks later, he had written to tell her he was engaged to a Miss Seraphine Alcott of Charleston. He was the happiest he had ever been. He wanted her to come for the engagement celebration. He wanted her blessing. She had written back that she would come. She had not written what she intended to do when she arrived. Evander was 31 years old. He had his father's jaw and his grandfather's stubbornness and Cordelia's own eyes, that particular shade of gray that looked soft until the light changed and revealed the iron underneath. He was not a foolish man. She had made certain of it. She had raised him through her husband's death when Evander was barely 12, raised him through the loss of their first estate, through the slow and grinding work of rebuilding the Voss name from something tarnished into something formidable. She had given him every advantage and withheld every excuse, and the result was a son she was genuinely proud of. Which was precisely why none of this made sense. Evander did not fall carelessly. He never had. Even as a young man, he had moved through the world with a kind of deliberate steadiness that sometimes frustrated her and always reassured her. He chose things carefully. He chose people carefully. So who had chosen him? From the edge of the ballroom, Cordelia watched Seraphine Alcott move through a cluster of guests near the fireplace. She was striking. There was no honest way to deny it. She wore ivory silk that caught the candlelight like a second skin, and she laughed at exactly the right moments, touched arms at exactly the right moments, tilted her head with the practiced precision of a woman who had learned long ago that beauty was a language, and she was fluent in it. But Cordelia had been beautiful once. She knew what it looked like from the inside. And what she saw in Seraphine Alcott did not look like a woman in love. It looked like a woman working. Evander stood beside his intended, with his hand at the small of her back, and even from this distance Cordelia could read the particular softness in his posture, the way a man holds himself when he believes he is exactly where he is meant to be. It made her chest ache in a way she had not expected, not because she wanted him to be unhappy, because she was afraid he already was, and simply didn't know it yet. Beside her, a young maid brushed past with a tray of empty glasses and murmured an apology without looking up. Cordelia stepped aside automatically, her eyes never leaving her son. There was a man at the far end of the room she did not recognize. That alone was unremarkable. Half these guests had been invited by Seraphine's people, names Cordelia had never encountered in 30 years of Virginia society. But this man was watching Seraphine the way Cordelia was watching her. Not with admiration, not with the particular hunger of a man charmed by a beautiful woman. With knowledge, the kind of watching that meant he already knew the ending of something. Cordelia filed his face away carefully. Dark coat, light eyes, a stillness about him that did not belong to a man at a party. She turned back toward the east parlor. The door was closed now. Whatever conversation had slipped through that crack was sealed back inside, tucked away, and the night continued around her, as though nothing in it had shifted. But something had shifted. Something had shifted the moment those words reached her ears, and Cordelia Voss, widow, Duchess, mother, was not a woman who ignored shifts. She had built an empire on paying attention to them. She moved through the room quietly, a woman no one saw, carrying nothing but a question that was quickly becoming something heavier. Who was Seraphine Alcott before she became Seraphine Alcott? And who, in the name of everything sacred, was the woman in that portrait? Cordelia found her answer faster than she expected, and she wished, with every quiet part of herself, that she had not. It happened near the servants' staircase at the back of the house, the narrow one behind the blue sitting room that guests never used because it smelled faintly of cedar and old wool and the particular mustiness of a passage built for people whose comfort was never the priority. Cordelia knew this staircase well. She had used it as a girl visiting her aunt's estate, sneaking down to the kitchen for honey cake at midnight, and she had loved it then for the same reason she used it now. Nobody watched it. She was carrying a small stack of folded linens, which she had picked up purely for the purpose of looking occupied, when she heard footsteps above her on the landing. Quick ones, not the steady rhythm of a servant on an errand, but the tight, clipped pace of someone who needed to be somewhere before they were noticed. She slowed. The footsteps stopped. Then came the voice, low, precise, entirely stripped of the warm, melodic quality Cordelia had been listening to all evening from across the ballroom. What came through the darkness of that stairwell was something else. Something with an edge to it like a letter opener, elegant, slim, and designed to cut. "You were not supposed to be here tonight," Seraphine said. "We agreed." A man's voice answered, the same low timbre Cordelia had clocked earlier from across the room. The still man. The one who had watched with knowledge rather than admiration. "Plans change," he said simply. "Nothing has changed." Seraphine's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the narrow stairwell every syllable carried with architectural precision. "He trusts me completely. The announcement will happen before midnight, and after that it becomes significantly harder to undo. You promised me until the end of the season." "And I'm telling you," the man said, "that the end of the season is no longer an option. Someone has been asking questions in Charleston. Careful questions, the kind that get answered eventually." Silence stretched between them like a held breath. Cordelia did not move. She did not breathe. She stood 4 steps below the landing, with 16 years of self-discipline pressed against her ribs like armor, and she listened. "How much do they know?" Seraphine asked. "Enough to unravel the Charleston story, possibly enough to trace it back further." Further meaning everything," the man said. "The name, the family, all of it." Another silence. Longer this time. And then something shifted in Seraphine's voice that Cordelia had not expected. Something that cracked the surface of the composure she had been witnessing all evening, and what came through was not guilt or fear, but something far colder. Calculation, pure and unhurried. "Then we move the timeline up," Seraphine said. "I'll speak to Evander tonight. You understand what that means." "I understand exactly what it means." Her voice had smoothed over again, seamless as poured glass. "I've worked too long for this family's name, to lose it over someone asking inconvenient questions in Charleston. The Voss estate is worth more than the risk. I intend to collect it." The linens fell from Cordelia's hands. Not all at once. One slipped first, then the others followed, a soft cascading collapse against the stone steps that in any other moment would have been nothing, barely a sound, the ordinary clumsiness of a tired servant at the end of a long evening. In that stairwell it sounded like a verdict. The footsteps above her stopped. "Someone's there," the man said. Cordelia did not think. She moved. She stepped back and pressed herself into the shadow behind the staircase door, pulling it almost entirely shut, leaving only the thinnest line of light between herself and the passage. Her heart was striking against her ribs with a force she had not felt since the night her husband died, since the night she had sat beside his bed and felt the particular stillness that comes when a room shifts from containing a life to only containing its memory. She heard Seraphine descend 2 steps, then stop, then, after a moment that felt considerably longer than it was, retreat back up. "A draft," Seraphine said. "Leave through the east entrance. I'll send word tomorrow." The footsteps separated, faded, The stairwell went quiet. Cordelia stood in the dark behind a half-closed door in her own house, in another woman's apron, with the sound of her son's name in a stranger's mouth still ringing in her ears like a bell struck wrong. The Voss estate is worth more than the risk. I intend to collect it. She had come here looking for a portrait, a name, a thread she could not explain and could not ignore. She had found something considerably worse than what she had imagined. Seraphine Alcott was not a woman in love with her son. She was a woman with a plan. And Cordelia, standing there in the cedar-smelling dark, understood with the terrible clarity that only a mother can possess, that Evander did not know. He was out there in that luminous ballroom with his hand at the small of this woman's back, and stars in his eyes, and not a single shield raised, because no one had told him he was standing in a battle. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped back into the corridor. The folded linens lay scattered across the steps behind her. She left them there. There was no version of this night that ended with her staying quiet. There was no version where she smoothed her apron and carried champagne, and waited to see how things resolved. She had not rebuilt the Voss name from ruin by waiting to see how things resolved. But she also could not walk into that ballroom, strip away her disguise, and declare war on a woman whose full hand she had not yet seen. She needed the other name, the one from the portrait, the one that Charleston apparently knew. She needed the man in the dark coat, and she needed all of it before her son looked across that ballroom and found her face among the servants, because if Evander saw her now, before she knew enough, before she had anything solid enough to hand him, he would not believe her. He would believe Seraphine. She knew this, not because her son was foolish, but because love is its own kind of blindness, and Cordelia had been blind once herself. She would not let him pay for it the way she had. Cordelia moved through the manor with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent 30 years learning how to be useful in a crisis. She did not rush. Rushing drew eyes, and eyes were the one thing she could not afford. She walked the way she had watched the other servants walk all evening, with purpose but without urgency, the particular rhythm of someone who belonged exactly where they were and had nowhere more important to be. It was a performance, and Cordelia had always been a capable performer. Her late husband Whitfield had called it her most dangerous quality. She had taken it as a compliment. The east corridor led her past the library, past the small receiving room where Seraphine's mother, a soft, vague woman named Philippa Alcott, who smiled at everything and appeared to understand nothing, sat fanning herself beside a potted fern. Cordelia kept her head angled away and her pace steady. Philippa did not look up. She needed the man in the dark coat. She had fixed his face in her memory with the thoroughness she applied to everything that mattered. Late 30s, perhaps early 40s, light eyes, the kind of pale gray that looked colorless in dim rooms. A stillness that did not come from ease but from discipline, the stillness of a man accustomed to watching without being watched. He wore his coat well but not expensively, which meant he was either modest or careful, and given the company he kept, she suspected it was the latter. He had left through the east entrance. She moved toward it. The east entrance opened onto a side garden that ran along the length of the house, a long, narrow strip of boxwood and late summer roses that the gardener kept obsessively symmetrical. At this hour it was unlit, except for the spillage of light from the ballroom windows, gold rectangles pressed into the dark grass like fallen paintings. Cordelia stepped outside and let the door close softly behind her. He was there, not leaving, as it turned out, but standing at the far end of the garden path with a cigarette he was not smoking, turning it between his fingers in the way of a man who had picked it up for the purpose of having something to do with his hands. He was looking out over the low garden wall toward the distant tree line, and he did not turn when she stepped onto the path. She walked toward him. She had not decided precisely what she would say. She had a general direction and a considerable amount of nerve, and she had always found that combination sufficient. She was within 10 feet of him when he spoke without turning. "The linens on the back staircase," he said. "That was you." It was not a question. She stopped walking. "It was," she said. He turned then. He looked at her the way people rarely looked at servants, which was directly, and she understood in that first second of eye contact that whatever she had expected from this man, it was not this. He was not alarmed. He was not calculating his next move with the particular tightening around the eyes that people displayed when they were afraid of being exposed. He looked almost relieved. "I wondered," he said quietly, "how long it would take someone in this house to start paying attention." Cordelia studied him. "You know who I am." "I know you're not a maid," he said. "The way you move through a room, the way you look at things. Servants learn not to look at things directly. You've never learned that." He paused. "I also know this is the Voss estate, and the only woman I've seen tonight who carries this house in her posture the way you do is the Duchess of Wrentham." She let a moment pass. Then she said, "And yet you said nothing." "I had no reason to," he said. "We want the same thing. You don't know what I want. You want to know who Seraphine Alcott actually is." He dropped the unlit cigarette into the grass and turned to face her fully. "So do I. The difference is that I have some of the answer, and you have access to the rest of it." Cordelia felt the shift in the air between them, the specific gravity of a conversation that has just become something more than a conversation. She had felt it in boardrooms. She had felt it across negotiating tables, while men underestimated her. She recognized it as the moment a thing became real. "Talk," she said. His name, he told her, was Prentice Hale. He had spent the last 8 months working as a private inquiry agent out of Richmond, retained by a family in Charleston whose eldest son had been engaged to a woman 2 years prior. A woman who had disappeared 3 weeks before the wedding with a substantial portion of the family's liquid assets and a set of jewels that had belonged to the boy's grandmother. The woman's name at that time had been Lavinia Crane. Cordelia absorbed this without expression. Inside, something cold and certain settled into place. "The portrait," she said. Prentice looked at her carefully. "You've seen it. 2 months ago. In my son's coat." She paused. The name on the back was not Seraphine. "No," he said. "It wouldn't be. She changes the name. The hair sometimes, the story always. But she keeps the portrait because the man who painted it is the one person she has ever appeared to genuinely care for, and she cannot make herself discard it." He said this without sentiment, the way a man reports a fact he has turned over many times. "It's the only consistent vulnerability I've found in 2 years of looking. 2 years. Cordelia let that settle over her. This was not a woman who had made one desperate choice and run from its consequences. This was a woman who had built a practice out of it. Evander was not the first. He would not have been the last. "How many?" she asked. "That I can confirm. 3. Charleston. Before that, a merchant family in Savannah. Before that, something in New Orleans that I haven't been able to fully untangle yet." He paused. "The Voss name is the largest target she's aimed at. Your son's estate and title would have been her most significant acquisition. Would have been, past tense, as though it were already prevented. It was not yet prevented." "She told the man tonight that she intends to move the timeline up," Cordelia said. "She plans to speak to Evander before the end of the evening." Something shifted in Prentice's expression for the first time. It was not fear precisely, but it was adjacent to it, the particular expression of a man who has been carefully managing the pace of something and has just learned the pace has changed without him. "If she gets a formal declaration from your son tonight," he said slowly, "in front of witnesses, it becomes considerably more complicated. She'll use the announcement as leverage. Any accusation made after a public declaration looks like interference, like jealousy, like a mother who cannot release her son." Cordelia felt the precision of that land exactly where it was aimed. She thought of Evander's face when he deflected her questions about the portrait, the gentleness of it, the ease. He would use that same gentleness against her if Seraphine reached him first and planted the seed of it. He would hear his mother's warnings and see in them what Seraphine would want him to see: overprotection, inability to let go. She knew how the story would be told. She had watched other women be told it. "Then, we have less time than I thought," she said. considerably less. Prentice looked back toward the house. Through the tall windows the candlelight flickered, and the shadows of dancing figures moved across the glass like a performance viewed from the wrong side. I have documentation in Richmond, signed statements from the Charleston family, records under the name Lavinia Crane that can be traced and verified. But none of it is here tonight, and tonight is what matters. Cordelia followed his gaze toward the windows. Evander was in there, her son, who had his father's jaw and her eyes, and 31 years of careful raising behind him, was in there believing himself the luckiest man in Virginia. And the woman standing beside him was counting the minutes until she could transform that belief into a chain. Inside Cordelia, something very old and very quiet made a decision. She had not come here with a plan, exactly. She had come with a feeling, and an apron, and 2 gold coins for a kitchen girl named Bet. She had come because something was wrong, and she could not name it, and she had never in her life been able to leave a wrong thing unnamed. She had the name now. I need you to get a message to Richmond tonight, she said. Whatever documentation you have, I need it in this house by morning. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. Can you do that? Prentice studied her for a moment. Then something in his face settled into a kind of quiet respect that he hadn't been wearing when this conversation began. Yes, he said. Good. She smoothed the front of the borrowed apron with both hands. And Mr. Hale, whatever you think you know about how this evening will proceed, I need you to understand something clearly. He waited. No one exposes anything tonight without my direction, she said. Not you. Not your Richmond documents. Nothing moves in this house without my hand on it. This is my family, my son, my estate. She held his gaze with the particular steadiness of a woman who had learned to make rooms go quiet simply by deciding to. Do we understand each other? A beat passed. Completely, Prentice said. She nodded once and turned back toward the house. Behind her the garden was still and dark and full of roses no one was looking at, and inside the manor her son was dancing with a woman whose real name was Lavinia Crane, and the clock on the mantel in the front hall was ticking toward midnight, and Cordelia Voss walked back through the east entrance door, with flowers still on her hands, and absolute war in her heart. The clock in the front hall read 11:43. When Cordelia stepped back into the light, she felt the change in the room before she saw it, the particular shift in the air that happens when a gathering moves from celebration toward ceremony, when people begin to orient themselves in the same direction without being told to. Guests were drifting toward the center of the ballroom with the unconscious choreography of an audience finding their seats. The violinist had stopped playing. Conversations were tapering into expectant quiet. Seraphine had moved the timeline up already. Cordelia crossed the room without hesitating, weaving between bodies with the smooth invisibility she had spent the evening cultivating, and found a position near the east wall, behind a cluster of older guests, where she could see the full length of the ballroom. Evander was standing near the fireplace. He had a glass in his hand that he wasn't drinking from, and the expression of a man preparing to say something he has rehearsed and is proud of. Seraphine stood beside him in her ivory silk, one hand resting lightly on his arm, and even from this distance Cordelia could see the particular quality of her stillness. Not the stillness of a woman moved by the moment. The stillness of a woman waiting for a cue, 17 minutes until midnight. Cordelia looked for Prentice. She found him near the far doorway, positioned with the same careful obscurity she had noted in the garden. Their eyes met briefly across the room. He gave the smallest shake of his head. Nothing yet. No documents. No proof that could be placed in anyone's hand tonight. She looked back at her son. Evander set his glass down on the mantelpiece and straightened his coat, and the room around him continued its slow lean toward attention, and Cordelia stood behind a cluster of strangers in a borrowed apron, and understood with complete clarity that she had arrived at the edge of the only decision that remained. She could wait. She could let the announcement happen, let the evening conclude, let Prentice's documents arrive in the morning, and come to Evander then, with evidence in hand, and a rational argument, and the kind of controlled, irrefutable case she preferred to build. That was the careful way, the strategic way, the way that protected her from looking like exactly what Seraphine would say she was, or she could move now, with nothing but her own word and 31 years of being his mother, and the sound of a voice in a dark stairwell saying things that could not be unsaid. She thought about Whitfield, her husband, gone 19 years, who had stood in a room very much like this one on the night he proposed to her, and looked at her with an openness so complete it had frightened her. She had spent years after his death wishing she had been less guarded with him while she had the chance, wishing she had let herself be seen more fully, loved more recklessly, before the time for it was simply over. Evander had that same openness. He had always had it, even when he tried to cover it with his grandfather's stubbornness, and Seraphine Alcott, or whatever her name was, had looked at that openness and seen an entry point. Cordelia felt something move through her that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, but carried elements of both. It settled into her spine like iron. Evander cleared his throat. The room finished quieting. She walked forward. She did not take off the cap. She did not announce herself. She simply walked through the gathered guests toward the fireplace with the unhurried certainty of a woman who owned the floor she was walking on, because she did, and the crowd parted the way crowds part for people who move, as though parting is the only reasonable response. Seraphine saw her first. Something moved across that carefully composed face, fast and then gone, too fast for anyone nearby to catch it. But Cordelia had been watching that face all evening, and she caught it. A flicker of calculation, a rapid internal assessment, and beneath it, pressed down but not entirely contained, the first genuine thing Cordelia had seen from her all night. Recognition, not of Cordelia specifically, of the type, of the particular quality of a woman walking toward you with nothing to lose and everything to protect, and the cold understanding that this was a variable that had not been accounted for. Evander turned. He saw her. She watched the confusion move across his face, the quick search for an explanation, the moment his eyes traveled from the cotton cap to the apron, to her hands, and then back up to her face. She watched him find her there, underneath it all, and she watched the confusion give way to something considerably more complicated. "Mother," he said, quiet enough that only the people closest heard it. The room didn't know yet. Most of them were still waiting for an announcement, still orienting toward the fireplace with champagne glasses in hand and patient smiles in place. They saw a servant who had apparently decided to approach the host at a deeply inconvenient moment, and the mild social discomfort of that rippled through the nearest cluster of guests. Cordelia stopped 3 feet from her son. "Evander," she said. Her voice was steady. She had built it to be steady. "I need a word with you, privately, before you say anything to this room." His jaw tightened. She knew that jaw. She had watched it learn to tighten. "This is not the moment. I know it isn't." She held his gaze with everything she had. "I'm asking you anyway." Seraphine stepped forward. Up close, her beauty was even more precise, the kind that had been studied and deployed rather than simply lived in, and her voice when she spoke was warm and gently amused, and perfectly pitched for the guests within earshot. "Evander, darling, perhaps we should let the staff—" "She is not staff." He said it automatically, still looking at Cordelia, and she felt the small mercy of it, that even caught off guard and embarrassed and confused, he had not pretended not to know her. He was, underneath everything, still her son. "No," Cordelia said, "I am not." And she reached up and took the cotton cap from her head and held it in both hands, and the silver of her hair came down around her face, and she watched the room understand what it was looking at. The silence that followed was the particular kind that has texture. She felt it against her skin. Seraphine went very still. Cordelia did not look at her. Not yet. She kept her eyes on Evander, because Evander was what mattered. Evander was the only thing in this room that had ever truly mattered. and she needed him to hear what she was about to say, not as a duchess, and not as a spectacle, but as his mother. "I heard something tonight that I cannot let you walk past without knowing," she said, low, steady, just for him. "I am asking you, as the woman who has never in 31 years deliberately steered you wrong, to give me 10 minutes in the library before you make any public declaration." She watched him. The war in him was visible. Embarrassment, loyalty, love. The very particular anguish of a man caught between two women he trusts in a room full of people watching him choose. Behind him, Seraphine said, very quietly, "Evander, she's doing exactly what I told you she might. She can't let you be happy without—" "Stop," he said it without turning around. And then, still looking at his mother, with something raw and unresolved moving behind his gray eyes, he said, 10 minutes. Cordelia exhaled once, small and controlled. She nodded and turned toward the library without waiting, because if she waited she would have to look at Seraphine, and if she looked at Seraphine right now, the thing in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief would make itself known in a way that would serve no one. She heard his footsteps behind her. She heard, beneath the resumed murmur of the room attempting to recover its composure, the sound of Seraphine saying something soft and reassuring to the nearest guests, smoothing it over, repairing the surface of the evening with the practiced ease of a woman who had done exactly this before. 3 families, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans. Cordelia pushed open the library door. The fire in here had burned low, the room lit mostly by the amber residue of a long evening, and it smelled of old paper and wood smoke and the particular mustiness of books that were read rather than displayed. Whitfield had loved this room. She had loved him in it. She felt his absence in it now the way she always did when things were difficult, like a hand that was no longer there to reach for. She set the cotton cap down on the desk. She heard Evander close the door behind him. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had been afraid of since the garden. Not anger, something worse. The careful, pained expression of a man who loves someone and is very much afraid she is about to wound him. "Whatever you heard," he began. "Her name is not Seraphine Alcott," Cordelia said. The room went quieter than it already was. Evander stared at her. She held his gaze, and she did not soften it, and she did not apologize for it, because he needed to see that she was certain, not suspicious, not anxious, certain, the way she had always been when something mattered. "Her name," Cordelia said, "is Lavinia Crane, and you are not the first man she has done this to." She watched her son's face, watched the thing she had dreaded move through it, the first instinct to refuse, to push back, to protect the version of events he had built his happiness on, and then, beneath that, something else, something she had not expected, something that looked terribly and unmistakably like a man who has just heard a name he has encountered before. Cordelia watched her son's face and said nothing. She had learned, over 30 years of difficult conversations, that silence after a revelation is not empty. It is the sound of a person rearranging themselves around a new truth, and it requires room. She gave him room. She stood beside the low fire in the library of the house she had built, and she waited while Evander looked at the floor and breathed and became someone who knew what he now knew. It took longer than she expected, and then he said, without looking up, "I found a trunk." She went still. 3 weeks ago, he said, before I came home. I was in her rooms in Baltimore. She had asked me to retrieve something for her, a book she'd left on the writing desk, and there was a trunk beside the wardrobe that had come open at the latch. I didn't go looking. I want you to understand that. I was not searching. "I know," Cordelia said quietly. "There were documents inside." He looked up now, and his face had the stripped quality of a man who has been carrying something heavy in a hidden place, and has just been given permission to set it down. A different name on some of them, certificates of some kind. I told myself it was old family paperwork. I told myself there was an explanation I didn't have yet, and that asking her directly was the right thing to do, and that I simply hadn't found the right moment. He paused. I kept not finding the right moment. Cordelia looked at her son, this man she had raised through every difficult season of both their lives, and felt the particular ache of watching someone you love recognize their own willingness to be deceived. It was not a comfortable thing to watch. It was not a comfortable thing to have done to yourself, and she suspected he knew she knew that, and she suspected that was part of why he could say it to her now. You were in love with her, she said. It was not an accusation. It was an acknowledgement, and she meant it as one. I thought I was. He moved to the chair beside the desk and sat down heavily. I think I was in love with who I believed she was, which is a different thing. I'm only now understanding how different. Cordelia crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him, the desk between them, holding nothing but her cotton cap and the guttered remains of a candle. Outside the library door, the party continued its uncertain murmur, guests suspended in the social discomfort of an interrupted evening, waiting for instruction. She told him everything: Prentice Hale, Charleston, Savannah, the name Lavinia Crane and the grandmother's jewels and the 3 weeks before a wedding, and the family who had hired a Richmond inquiry agent and never fully recovered their losses or their dignity. She told him about the stairwell, and the man in the dark coat, and the words she had carried back into the ballroom like coals in her bare hands. She told him about the garden and Prentice's relief, and the documentation traveling from Richmond through the night. She told him everything, because he was her son, and he deserved the full weight of it, not a managed version shaped to protect him from pain. He was 31 years old. He had earned the unmanaged truth. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "She was going to speak to me tonight, before midnight. She said she wanted the announcement made, while the energy in the room was still." He stopped, pressed 2 fingers to his forehead. She was managing the timeline. Yes. She knew someone was asking questions in Charleston. Yes. And I was the solution. He said it flatly. Not with self-pity, but with the particular flatness of a man examining a thing clearly for the first time. A formal announcement in front of witnesses would have made any accusation look like interference. She would have had my name and the estate as insulation before anyone could reach her with documentation. That is what Prentice believes, yes. Evander stood. He moved to the fireplace and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she let him have that too. The fire had burned down to coals, and the room was cooling slowly, and she watched the set of his shoulders, and recognized in them something she had not seen since he was a boy, facing the first real loss of his life. The death of his father, the night he had stood in a doorway very much like this one, and understood for the first time that some things do not come back. He turned around. "I need to go back into that room," he said. "I know. She'll have a version of this already prepared. Something that makes what just happened look like an aging Duchess unable to release her only son." He said it without bitterness. He said it because it was true, and they both knew it, and pretending otherwise would have been an insult to both of them. "She's had practice," Cordelia said. "She'll use it, then I need to move before she does." Cordelia stood. She smoothed the front of the borrowed apron one last time, a gesture she recognized as habit now, the kind of small steadying motion that the body finds when the mind is working very fast. Then she untied it and folded it over the back of the chair and stood in her own plain traveling dress, which was not what she would have chosen for an occasion like this, but was at least entirely her own. "You don't have to do this tonight," she said. "The documentation arrives in the morning. You could simply end the evening, send the guests home, and address it privately." "No," he said. "If I send these people home tonight with questions and no answers, she will spend the night between now and morning building a story, and she is very good at stories." He looked at his mother steadily. "I'm not." Cordelia felt something move through her chest that was warm and quiet and proud. "No," she agreed. "You've always been better at the truth." He held out his hand to her. She looked at it for a moment. Her son's hand. The same hand she had held crossing streets when he was 4 years old. The same hand she had gripped in hospital rooms and boardrooms and graveyards. She took it, and he tucked it into the crook of his arm the way his father used to do, and they walked to the library door together. They entered the ballroom side by side. The effect was immediate. The uncertain murmur of the room resolved into silence with a speed that told Cordelia the guests had been waiting for exactly this, had felt the shape of something unresolved and been unable to leave it alone. 200 eyes found them at the doorway, and the candles burned, and the air held its breath. Seraphine was standing near the fireplace where they had left her. She had not moved far. She had been working the nearest cluster of guests, with quiet, fluid reassurance, and Cordelia could see from the posture of the people around her that she had been effective. The seeds were already there, the gentle concern, the small, confused sorrow of a woman baffled by an inexplicable intrusion. She looked up when they entered, and her expression arranged itself into something soft and welcoming and privately relieved, the expression of a woman whose difficult moment has just resolved itself, and she moved toward Evander with her hands slightly extended, and Cordelia felt him steady himself beside her. He stopped walking. Seraphine stopped. The room watched. "I won't be making an announcement tonight," Evander said. His voice was clear and even, and carried the full length of the room without effort. "I owe my guests an apology for the disruption, and I owe several people a great deal more than that, which I intend to address properly." He paused. "This evening is concluded." The silence stretched. Seraphine's expression did not break. Cordelia gave her that much. It flickered, adjusted, and settled into something wounded and dignified, the expression of a woman wronged, and she held it with the consistency of someone who had worn it before. She looked at Evander with her pale eyes full of a sorrow so crafted it was almost beautiful, and she said, very softly, "Evander, please, whatever you've been told." "Her name," said a voice from the far doorway, "is Lavinia Crane." Prentice Hale stood at the entrance to the ballroom with his dark coat and his light eyes, and a leather document case in his hand that had not been there an hour ago. He had not gone to Richmond. He had gone, Cordelia understood immediately, to wherever he had been keeping his materials close, because he was a man who had been waiting for this evening for a long time, and he had not come unprepared. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Seraphine turned toward him, and in the turning she made the first uncontrolled movement Cordelia had witnessed from her all evening. Not large, just real. A flinch so small that only the people closest to her would have caught it. But in a room this silent, small things were very loud. It was enough. Cordelia watched the room recalibrate, watched understanding move from face to face like a flame passed between candles, watched the social architecture Seraphine had spent the entire evening constructing shift and crack along invisible fault lines. Seraphine looked back at Evander one final time. Whatever she saw in his face made her stop. She looked, in that moment, less like a woman who had been caught, and more like a woman who was very tired. And Cordelia found, to her own surprise, that she felt something adjacent to sorrow for her. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but the particular sorrow of recognizing that whatever had shaped a person into what Seraphine was, it had not been nothing. It had not been simple. She turned and walked toward the far exit with her head up and her spine straight, and her ivory silk catching the last of the candlelight, and the crowd parted for her, and she was gone. Nobody followed her. Cordelia stood in her own ballroom in a plain traveling dress with flowers still faintly visible on her left hand, and she felt the full weight of the evening settle into her bones all at once. The particular exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from holding yourself together through too much, the kind that only arrives once the reason for holding is past. Evander's hand found her shoulder. She reached up and covered it with her own. Outside, somewhere in the dark beyond the garden, a carriage moved away down the gravel drive. The sound of it faded, and then it was only the manor, and the dying candles, and the quiet. "The guests," she said. "Will see themselves out," he said. "They've had enough entertainment." She almost smiled. It felt strange on her face, but not unwelcome. Later, when the rooms had emptied and the servants moved quietly through the house restoring order to things that could be restored, Cordelia sat in the library again, alone this time, in the chair by the desk with the cotton cap still folded over the arm of the other chair, and the fire rebuilt, and the room smelling of old paper and wood smoke, and the quiet particular to houses after a storm has passed through them. She thought about Whitfield. She thought about the years she had spent making herself indestructible, so that the people who depended on her would always have something solid to press against. She thought about how she had come here, with flour on her hands, and a borrowed apron, and nothing but the feeling that something was wrong, and how that had been, in the end, precisely enough. She thought about Evander upstairs, alone in his own rooms with the wreckage of a belief he had carried carefully for months, and she thought that tomorrow she would climb those stairs and sit with him in his grief, without managing it, without shaping it into something more bearable than it actually was, because he deserved that. The full weight of a thing, and someone beside him while he carried it. She picked up the cotton cap from the arm of the chair. She held it in both hands for a moment, this small plain object that had made her invisible in her own house. And she thought that there was something in that worth keeping, not the invisibility, but the reminder that the house was hers, not because of what she wore or what she was called, but because of what she had built in it and protected in it, and refused to abandon when abandoning would have been considerably easier. She set the cap down. She straightened in the chair. Outside the library windows, the Virginia dark was very deep and very quiet, and somewhere in it Lavinia Crane was moving toward whatever came next for a woman like her, and somewhere in Richmond, a family in Charleston was about to receive news they had stopped expecting, and somewhere upstairs her son was sitting with the particular silence of a man learning the shape of his own resilience. Cordelia Voss looked at the low fire and let herself be tired. Just for tonight. Tomorrow she would begin again. She did not sleep. She had told herself she would, had climbed the stairs at some point past 2 in the morning with every intention of it, had sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room she had taken rather than her usual chambers, because her usual chambers felt like too much of herself for a night this stripped, and she had watched the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her, and understood that sleep was not coming. At 4:30 she rose, dressed without calling for anyone, and went back downstairs. The manor was different in the hours before dawn, quieter than quiet, the specific stillness of a large house between the end of one day's business and the beginning of the next. The candles had all been extinguished, and the fires banked, and the rooms restored with the efficiency of a well-run household, and walking through them now, Cordelia felt the particular quality of the night before already beginning to recede into the past, becoming something that had happened rather than something that was happening. She went to the kitchen. She did not know precisely why. Some instinct toward the ordinary, perhaps, toward the room in this house that had no pretension in it, that existed purely for the business of sustaining people, which seemed, at 4:30 in the morning after a night like this one, like the most honest room available. She put the kettle on herself. She was standing at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had made badly, when she heard the footsteps on the back staircase. Not the tight-clipped pace of someone with an agenda, slow ones. The footsteps of a person who is not sure they want to arrive wherever they are going, but is going anyway. Evander appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was still dressed, which meant he also had not slept, and he had the particular hollowed quality of a man who has spent the night in close conversation with himself and has not entirely liked what was said. He sat down at the table across from her without speaking. She pushed her cup toward him. He took it, drank, made a face at the quality of it, and set it down. Something in that small, ordinary exchange, the face he made, the way it was so entirely him, so entirely unchanged by everything the night had done, made her chest tighten in a way she had not expected. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I knew." He said it to the table first, and then looked up and said it to her face, because Evander had always been, underneath everything, constitutionally incapable of the comfortable version of a hard truth. Not everything. Not her name or the other families or any of what Hale brought, but I knew something was constructed. I had known for perhaps 3 weeks. He paused. I chose not to look at it directly. Cordelia was quiet. I think, he said carefully, that I wanted to have chosen correctly badly enough that I was willing to not look at certain things. Which is its own kind of dishonesty, and I am not. He stopped, started again. I am not going to excuse it. She thought about what to say, and then decided not to say the thing she had prepared, and to say the true thing instead. I did the same thing once, she said. With your father's business dealings in the last year before he died, there were things I saw that I chose to frame differently, because I needed them to be different. She held his gaze. I have never told anyone that. He looked at her for a long moment. Were you ever going to? I'm telling you now. Something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with the force of the evening's earlier revelations, but quietly, the way light shifts in a room when a cloud moves, changing everything slightly without making a sound. They sat in the kitchen while the dark outside the windows began its slow conversion toward gray, and they talked in the way that people talk when they have stopped managing each other, which is the only way that matters. He told her about Baltimore and the trunk, and the 3 weeks of deliberate not looking. She told him about the coins she had pressed into Bet, the kitchen girl's hand, and the particular feeling of walking through her own party as someone no one watched. He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. It was nearly 6 when they heard the horse, a single rider, coming up the gravel drive at a pace that was not leisurely, and both of them registered it in the same moment, and were both already moving toward the front of the house when the knock at the door came. Cordelia opened it herself. Prentice Hale stood on the step with his dark coat dusty from riding, and his light eyes carrying something she had not seen in them before. Not the controlled watchfulness of the garden or the ballroom. Something urgent. There's something you need to know, he said, about the New Orleans connection. She stepped back to let him in. I told you last night I hadn't been able to fully untangle it, he said, moving into the hallway, nodding once to Evander, who had come to stand behind his mother. I said 3 confirmed families. That was accurate as of last night. He paused. It is no longer accurate this morning. Cordelia felt the particular quality of attention that comes when something you thought was finished reveals another room. How many? She asked. That's the thing, Prentice said. In New Orleans, she wasn't working alone. The hallway was very still. There is a man, he continued. Not the one from last night. Someone older. Someone who has been moving her from city to city, identifying targets, building the groundwork before she arrives. Last night's visitor was a courier, essentially, a message carrier. The actual architect of this is someone neither of us has seen yet. He looked between them, and based on what I found in the documentation that arrived from Richmond this morning, he has a specific reason for targeting the Voss family above the others. Cordelia felt Evander go still beside her. What reason? She asked. Prentice reached into the document case. He produced a single page and held it out to her. She took it. It was a copy of a property record, dated 18 years ago. The name at the top was not Voss, and not Alcott, and not Crane. It was Whitfield, her husband's name. Her husband's signature at the bottom of a document she had never seen, attached to a property she had never known existed, transferred to a party whose name she did not recognize, with a date that placed it 6 months before his death. The kitchen went cold. She read it twice. She read it the way she had trained herself to read difficult things, without flinching, without looking away, taking in each word and placing it carefully in the architecture of everything she already knew and understanding, with the rising certainty of a woman who has spent 30 years paying attention to the things that don't quite fit, that this was not the end of something. This was what the whole thing had been pointing toward. Evander was reading over her shoulder. She heard the change in his breathing. She looked up at Prentice. He wasn't after the Voss name, she said. Not a question. No, Prentice said quietly. He was after what's attached to it. She stood in her own hallway in the pale first light of a Virginia morning, with a document in her hands that rewrote 18 years of certainty, and she felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that was entirely unlike last night. Last night had been about protecting her son. This was something older and deeper and considerably more dangerous, and it had been in the walls of her life for nearly 2 decades without her knowing. Whitfield, her husband. The man she had loved and buried and built everything in his absence. What had he known, what had he done, and who, all this time, had been waiting quietly at the edge of her life for the right moment to collect? She folded the document carefully. She looked at her son. He looked back at her. He had his father's jaw and her eyes and 31 years of being built by both of them, and in this moment he looked neither young nor old, but simply present, which was, she thought, exactly what she needed him to be. "All right," she said. She handed the document back to Prentice. "Tell me everything." And somewhere beyond the tall windows of Ashford Manor, the sun came fully over the Virginia tree line, and the new day began, and the story that Cordelia Voss had believed she understood for 18 years revealed itself to be something else entirely. She was not afraid. She was, if anything, awake in a way she had not been in a very long time, and that, she thought, would have to be enough to begin with. Did you see that coming? Because I certainly did not expect Whitfield's name on that document. What did he know? Who is the man behind all of this? And how deep does this go? If you have stayed with Cordelia through every moment of this story, through the flower on her hands and the borrowed apron and the dark stairwell and everything that came after, then you already know she is not finished. Not even close. This story is just beginning to show its real face. If you want to find out what Whitfield was hiding, who has been waiting in the shadows for 18 years, and what Cordelia does when the enemy turns out to be something far closer than a stranger in ivory silk, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on every notification, because the next part of this story will not wait, and neither, I suspect, will you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for every moment you gave this story. It means more than you know, and Cordelia thanks you too.